Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to the daily check-in for July 14th, 2020. I'm Ned Bellavance, Ned1313 on Twitter. Today's topic, we're talking about Terraform because it's Terraform Tuesday, and we're going to talk about how do you figure out one of the more complex resources in Terraform. And we'll dive into what I mean by that in a moment. And then we're actually going to walk through sort of live, because I'm figuring this out as I go, a live example of how I might parse one apart. Before we do that, housekeeping item. The only one I have is just a quick reminder. I have a Terraform certification guide that's available on LeanPub. If you're interested, the minimum purchase price is only $15. So it's actually a pretty inexpensive guide. And if you're looking to get that Terraform certification, here is your opportunity to do it. So enough plugging for me. Let's check in with you. How you doing? Welcome to Tuesday. Are you having tacos today? I sadly am not having tacos. We're doing a grill night. I know, it's disappointing for everyone, but sometimes you can't do Taco Tuesday on Tuesday, but we did have tacos on Saturday. So that's happy. If you're a taco fan, I'd love to hear what your favorite taco is. And nothing tech-wise, just what's your favorite kind of taco? Are you chicken, beef, fish, vegetarian? What kind of taco is your favorite? And tell me, flour, corn tortilla, what's going on there? Just feed it back to me. Tell me what's going on with your taco preference. Right? And you can tell me whether you think taco is a sandwich or not. That's a heated debate. Is a hot dog a sandwich? I don't know. Anyway, so that's enough with the check-in. Let's talk about our topic today, which is Terraform resources are sometimes very complicated, and figuring out how to use them is not always easy. Examples are not always forthcoming, and the documentation may not live up to the hype. So how do you go about figuring it out yourself, basically? So this all sprouted from a LinkedIn conversation I was having with someone who asked me if I had some good examples for how to use slots in function apps. Oh, and Jawan Mayberry tells me that salmon is his favorite kind of taco in a corn tortilla, which, I mean, if you're doing fish tacos, corn tortilla is really your only choice as far as I'm concerned. Anyway, so the conversation I was having, he basically was looking to deploy Azure function apps and add slots. And I think slots is a relatively new feature. It was one I hadn't heard of. I knew about app slots when it came to web apps, but I didn't know that function apps had those too. And that's kind of cool. But I think it's very new. It's not even in the version of the Azure CLI I had installed. I had to install a newer version to even see that functionality. So I looked at, he sent me an example of his config, and I'm not going to share that because it might have had a little bit of sensitive information in there. But basically, in order to create it, you have to create a number of resources. So let me just share out my screen real quick. Okay, there we go. And bring up the browser here. Here's an example of how you might do this. So I'm looking at the documentation for Azure. Let me blow this up by a few. And this is an example of creating a function app that includes a slot. So if we look at the resource type, it's Azure RM function app slot is the resource type. And so in the full example they're giving, you have to create a resource group. You have to create a storage account. And for me, I was like, why do you have to create a storage account? That's the storage account that your service plan uses for logging and storage of some data. So you need to set that up if you want to use app insights or loggings. And it is a required thing when we get down to the configuration. Okay, so then you have to create an app service plan. You have a bunch of different options there. The most common one is called Dynamic, which is their serverless version of this. So it only spins up things on demand and then shuts them down. That's just, if you're going for that consumption model, that's the easiest way to go. This example shows standard S1, but you might want to go dynamic, and I believe the size is Y1 for reasons. Okay, then we get to our function app, and we have a bunch of properties for our function app. This is going to take up the production slot in your Azure functions. And then the next resource is the function app slot. And so this is going to be an additional slot within your function. Okay, so I get this. This kind of makes sense to me. One of the things that I do when I'm not sure how this is going to work in the real world is I start reading through the documentation, and then I go and deploy it through the console/portal, whatever you want to call it. In AWS, they call it the console. Azure calls it the portal. So what I did is I just went to the Azure portal and I clicked add Azure function, and I walked through the wizard and just took all the defaults for a particular deployment, and it created these resources for me. And so this kind of lines up with what we just saw in the previous configuration. I have things, and this is really small, so let me blow this up too. I have things in here like the app service plan. I've got my storage account. I've got the app service itself, which is the function app. And then I've got an app service slot. And it also created an app insight for me, but you could create an app insight outside of this and just point it at that one. So that's how that all kind of ties together. Cool. Now I know what's being generated by the wizard. I can use that as information for when I'm trying to create my own configuration. So if I go into this actual function app and look at it, and I don't have anything loaded at the moment, this is a totally empty thing. I can scroll down here to deployment slots and wait a few moments. There we go. Here's my 2 slots, and we can see that the app that I created initially is labeled as production, and that's the active slot. And then we have the development slot, which I created separately. Okay, so I have all this information. Now, how does this tie back into here? Well, for my argument reference, I can infer a lot of the arguments that I need and the value that makes sense for them from the example and the documentation. But we get down to this area here, and this is the thing that the person I was talking to was struggling with: app settings. And in app settings, it has all these app settings, and it basically just says, you know what, I'm just going to point you off at the app settings documentation for Azure. And it doesn't even do that here. That would be helpful, right? What are all these app settings and what do I do with them? You actually have to go, I believe, to the function app documentation, and down in the function app documentation, if we scroll all the way down here, it has a link to the app settings documentation in Azure. But this is a long document. There's a lot of information here. How am I supposed to parse this apart? I have no idea. Okay, well, what I can do is let's go to the command line. And in here, I've logged in with the Azure CLI, which means I can run Azure CLI commands against the thing that I've already deployed. And I think I already, hopefully, okay. So I can use AZ function app deployment slot list to list out the slots that I currently have. And this will list out the 2 slots I already have. And it's a lot of information here. We don't have to look through all of that. Probably a more useful one, and I ran this a little earlier, if we want to look at all the app settings. So that was the thing that this gentleman was struggling with, was the app settings. What should I set? What should I not set to set up the slot and then this also the app settings? Awesome. Well, by running app settings list, I get a list of all the app settings for the production slot in here, and it gives me all this information. So if I want to build my app settings for a new function, I can grab some of this, or at least infer what this thing should be. Okay, pretty awesome here. All right, so the next thing that I might want to do is get the same settings for my app, my function slot. So can I do that? Does this command allow me to specify a slot? So we'll just ask for help on this. And hopefully I'm able to specify, yes, I can. Look at that. So it says I can specify the name of the slot as well as everything else in here. So if I just do -H and we'll try development, hopefully this will get the app settings for my development slot as well. And it did. Awesome. Okay, so now when I'm creating the app, the function app slot, I now have all of these settings that I can use for that as well. Perfect. So generally speaking, when I'm trying to figure out how to use a particular resource within Terraform, and I'm uncertain of some of the settings, the nice thing to know about that is that all of the settings are using basically the same SDK that the CLI is using for all these cloud providers. So if I'm not sure what's going on behind the scenes, I can deploy an example instance of the thing I'm trying to create, then use the CLI to query about that particular resource, and I should be able to get the values that I need, or at least be able to infer what type of values should go in that configuration. So when I'm trying to pick apart something that's a little bit nasty like this, or actually I did this same thing when I was trying to build out an AWS code pipeline, and it had a lot of esoteric things in there, and also the code build and code commit. I built all that stuff manually first, used the AWS CLI to grab that information, and then use that information to create the Terraform config and deploy it. So those are all the different components that I threw together to be able to understand how to use that resource. And then I had a good example of how to do it. So hopefully this helps you out when you're trying to pick apart a particularly thorny resource in Terraform. Is there something that you've been struggling with in Terraform? Let me know. I'm glad to talk it over, and we can kind of do another one of these live demo things and see how it goes. But that's all I have for today. Thank you so much for watching. Please share and subscribe if you don't mind. I really appreciate it, and it helps me reach a wider audience. Tomorrow is Tech Analysis Wednesday, and that should be pretty interesting because there's been a few acquisitions over the last week, and I have some thoughts about them. So that will be the topic for tomorrow.